Um, Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Ellington. I'm the Interim Executive Director for the Entrepreneurship Center here at UNC Kenan-Flagler. And today I'm very, very excited to have, as I said before, this panel of speakers and Rodney Sampson moderating this conversation on building equitable sort of, tech startup venture ecosystems, particularly in this fourth industrial revolution with public partnerships and more. I got to know Rodney when he first was a speaker for us for the Frontiers of Entrepreneurship conference in Florida, actually right before the pandemic started. And we were so excited to invite him to become a Cohane visiting professor for UNC Chapel Hill and Duke. And more recently, he's been leading two of our Scale School certificate courses, one of them being Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Solutions, and the other being the Black Technology Ecosystem Investors courses. So in the few years that I've gotten to know Rodney, I know that he's very passionate about entrepreneurship, about ecosystem, and most importantly, about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and allowing that opportunity for everyone. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rodney.
Thank you, Jen. And I share the sentiment as well. I've enjoyed my relationship with the University of North Carolina and Duke and Stanford Technology Ventures program as well. And we were actually working to have this conversation in person back in West Palm Beach. And we decided not to do it in person, but to do it virtually. And the fact that we can now follow up and have this in Black History Month, which is really a part of Black History Year, Black History Decade, Black History Century that we're in, is even more exciting. So let me establish some starting context, and I'll kind of run this a little bit the way I run my classes on campus. So the starting context for today's conversation is, fueled by edge technologies and wow, hundreds of billions in venture capital. I think the final number in 2021 was over $360 billion, which if you think about it, was double the year before in 2020. And then 2020 was the largest year for venture capital. And you say, wait, I thought businesses were closing and we were in the middle of a pandemic and 40% of African-American owned businesses closed their doors at the beginning of the pandemic. Yet in this space, this niche, this tech startup and venture ecosystem, $360+ billion was invested in high growth technology firms in 2021. At the same time, our federal government is investing billions via Build Back Better, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, State Small Business Credit Initiative, so much more. There's the proposed American Innovation and Competitiveness Act, the Endless Frontier Act, unprecedented amounts of capital that are flowing from the federal agencies to the states, municipalities, and beyond. So I'm excited to host this conversation on building equitable technology, startup, and venture ecosystems in the fourth industrial revolution via public partnerships and more. And joining me today is Candice Brackeen. She's the general partner of Lightship and also Lightship Fund and the founder of the Lightship Foundation. Shuprotim Bhaumik is a partner at HR&A Advisors, and Brent Webb is Director of Life Sciences at Mortenson Development. How are y'all doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having us.
Good. Good. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we do some lightning round introductions? I'd like for each of you to introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about your journey. We've got some time today. And also contextually talk about it in terms of these ecosystems and in terms of public-private partnerships. And so we'll start with lightning introductions. We'll start with Candice, then we'll go to Brent, then Shuprotim, you'll bring us home, okay?
Awesome. Well, Rodney, thank you for letting me enter your world and speak to your community. I, I stand on the shoulders of giants. And so you've always been one of those giants. You're the OG of, for me, Black tech ecosystem building. A lot of things that I've learned have come from you. So I'm the back in 2019 Cincinnati area. We're approaching our 5th year of operations. We operate those accelerators now in Cincinnati, Tulsa, Detroit, and moving into for the next 12 months. We also now called Lightship Bootcamp. That was originally NUMI Accelerator that we acquired from Angela Benton back in 2018. We run a pitch competition online called Twitch Pitch, where we've had over 100 founders since the beginning of COVID come online and pitch. Prizes to start were $10,000 and $25,000 of non-dilutive capital. This year, we'll be moving into $250,000 and $500,000 investments for companies around the country. Also, general partner of Lightship Capital, which is a $50 million fund that invests in BIPOC founders, people who identify as women, those from the LGBTQ community, and people who have disabilities. So the majority of Americans. We have 14 companies in that portfolio right now, and I just love this work.
Thank you so much, and welcome to class. Brent?
Sure, I can go. Thank you, Rodney. And I echo Candice's comments. I really appreciate being in your world. I don't think I've been in a classroom for a really, really long time, especially in this format. And I like how this panel and the conversation today is really a continuation of what you and I have talked about for now almost a year. What's really interesting is that I actually got connected to Rodney from somebody at HR&A. And it was because I was trying to explore within a built environment how to lean in and make that early upfront investment to create that foundation for an ecosystem to allow for these innovation and type of technology transfer districts to exist. So my world's obviously very different than many on this stage, except for maybe Shuprotim, in that I work in the built environment, and 90% of the time you're spending your time indoors. And so how can I think about leaning in from my perspective as a real estate investor and developer on making sure that I'm setting the stage early enough on so that it's easy for these connections to happen. It's easy for these new startup businesses to flourish, but it's even easy for organizations like Candice to really flourish and support entrepreneurs within the built environment, because you can't just think of the building as a box. You really have to think about all these components, including programming and the tenants, and you have to be intentional from day one. And fortunately, we have conversations with people like Rodney, as well as people at HR&A, to help us understand how to execute on that. And I think where I'm hoping to take the conversation today is how do we even pull it back further, engage the community early on, think about it from real estate investment perspective, and how do you get buy-in from the other key stakeholders that are part of the ecosystem. Thank you, Rodney.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brent. Shuprotim.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Shuprotim Bhaumik. Delighted to be part of the conversation with Rodney and Candice and Brent. So I'm a partner at HR&A Advisors. HR&A is a economic development and real estate consulting firm. My sort of practice is really at the intersection of economic development strategy and public-private partnerships. And so over the last few decades, one of the things that I have been really passionate and interested about is kind of thinking about the tech ecosystem, because that really offers in a variety of different ways to a variety of different people with different levels of skills and education, a really compelling, upwardly mobile sort of job trajectory, employment trajectory. So that's the kind of stuff that really interests me. I think the tech ecosystem is really, really interesting. Some of the work that I do and HR&A does is focused around thinking about how big is the tech ecosystem? And more and more we're realizing it's just bigger than what most people think it is. I was just this morning, I was in a meeting with the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce, and the executive director asked me, what most surprised you about this piece of work? And I said, I didn't realize Chicagoland had such a big tech ecosystem. And it's one of the fastest growing ecosystems, right? If you look at the job growth that's happening in tech, even in the midst of the pandemic, it's been pretty impressive. So it's big and it's growing. So that's the first thing I would say. What interests me? The second thing which interests me is that sort of, the upward mobility that it offers, right? One of the things that we found out in our look at tech ecosystems throughout the country is that a lot of the jobs in the tech ecosystem actually don't need a bachelor's degree above. There are lots of jobs in the tech ecosystem which you can do potentially with an associate's degree or even a high school degree with some advanced training. And those jobs offer significantly higher wages and upward mobility than a typical job would anyone with those kind of qualifications might get, like a retail job or a cash manager and things of that sort. So that's the other part which I think is really, really interesting about the tech ecosystem. The last part is sort of kind of a little bit of a downer, which is if you look at the tech ecosystem, again, this is true for the country in general and for major cities, if you presentation of both Black and Latinx as well as women. And you look at, the number of percentage of women generally in the workforce, you look at the percentage of Black Latinx, whether it's in the population, the workforce, tech generally tends to employ significantly lower number of minorities, significantly lower number of women compared to the workforce in general and the population in general. So that to me is like a really, really tremendous opportunity to think about how do we diversify tech? How do we offer these stable, high growing jobs to parts of the population that have not been sort of attended to? And so taking all this stuff, and what brings me here to this discussion over here is I work a lot with institutions like educational institutions, community colleges to develop workforce programs. I work with folks like Brent over here and his company, thinking about sort of Mortenson develops the four walls of a building, but really what happens is inside those four walls and what should happen inside those four walls to develop a tech ecosystem that's growing, that's equitable, is kind of a part of my practice that I often focus on. And of course, now with we were talking about this a little while back. This is a really opportune time because the federal government is putting in so much of money through the American Rescue Plan, through the Investment in Jobs Act, and with a very, very deliberate and intentional focus on equity. So I think this is a great time to be having this discussion as to how we inject more equity into the tech ecosystem.
Definitely. Thanks for that starting context. So class, let's think a little bit like this. So, let's talk a little bit about the different funding buckets that actually fund the infrastructure, the ecosystems, which let's say if ecosystems were the infrastructure, the programs that accelerate talent development, workforce development, but also new venture creation. And what we've realized is that economic development has evolved in the last decade or so from attraction and retention to new venture creation and rapid upskilling. And today's prices aren't yesterday's prices. It costs money to do this work. And so as ecosystem builders, we're often, not just thinking about how to offer better pedagogical, programming and curriculum, we simultaneously are thinking about how do we fund this. And so the tech startup and venture ecosystem primarily has provided on private capital, wealthy, rich people, mostly rich men, mostly wealthy, rich white men, and institutions that are private. Today, though, we have represented, the build community. So Brent represents large scale developers. And he didn't talk a lot about, the size, breadth, and depth of Mortenson, but like, this is the company that builds stadiums and builds big buildings and works on, 1 million, 2, 3, large commercial developments that may house residential, commercial, retail, under the auspices of innovation and life sciences. And what we figured out is that too is a source of capital. The third one, though, however, has existed pre-COVID in some instances rather, but now is sort of unprecedented. And so I like our subject matter experts to talk a little bit about what are those specific buckets of money that they've heard about, or they're in tune to, or they're in the pipeline that could fund this work to produce more high growth companies and to produce more high growth, upperly mobile talent. Candice, we'll start with you, and then Brent, and then Shuprotim, bring us home.
Okay, so Rodney, I think I might need you to help me frame this just a little bit more. So I have a question for you to start. So you remember when PPP came out and suddenly everyone didn't have a banker? They were unbanked.
Exactly, right.
Okay, I feel as if all of this funding is going to run into the same issue because people don't have a relationship with the places you apply to.
Right.
Right? Okay, so there are lots of different new buckets of money. You just have to know where to go, and you need to start building relationships with these people because it's not going to happen. Some of these things have already been decided. So I guess I'll place it in how I've started things and where I'm going to for some of these buckets. So I started this organization with a meetup group. I was the only woman of color in my town that had a tech company, and I wanted to make another Black woman, or another woman of color actually, feel comfortable. So I started a meetup group. That meetup group grew from 11 people to 75 people in 6 months. So I went to the ecosystem, the head of the ecosystem, and I said, hey, I need some funding for this meetup group. I've been bootstrapping this whole time. They said, keep doing your own thing. Grassroots efforts are great. We don't have any money. I look around, everybody else is getting funding, right? Everybody else doesn't look like me. And so that was like my initial way of getting into the ecosystem and realizing there was a disparity. So I started to kind of talk to different people, the city of Cincinnati, different foundations, and everybody was like, but they're doing that. I said, well, I went to them and they told me, no, they're not funding people for this work. So then I went a little bit higher. I went to the state and I said, hey, this money's not making it down to me. So all of this talking got me into some rooms with council members and state senators, and they're all going, oh, there's a disparity. So we did a disparity study for a year back in 2016. And what it showed was we are a very diverse state. We are not equitable with our dollars. The state then put in some money for us to start an accelerator. That's how we got started, but those relationships didn't stop. So kept talking to council members, kept talking to my government officials, and kept going to meetings that I'm certain that weren't even on a public calendar, but should have been, right? And kept having those relationships with people. So now here we are in 2022, and we've made it through PPP. We can see SSBCI, the State Small Business Credit Initiative, coming for us specifically. And we're building relationships to get a piece of the money for the states that we do work in. And so I think both of us could probably talk through State Small Business Credit Initiative, but it's dollars that go into several buckets. Some of it's for capital and some of it is for really ecosystem building. And so it depends on your state and how they want to spend those dollars. So you have to really do the research for how they're going to do it. Are they going to put it in VC? Are they going to make small business loans? Are they going to help with acceleration and boot camps? All of those things are different. And there is a bucket for everyone. And there's also a very large bucket for socially economically disadvantaged individuals, SETIs, right? That is as large as the last rescue plan. But now we're running into a situation, as we've all talked about many times online and in person, that we have new organizations standing themselves up and pretending that they too invest in SETI individuals. They may not have. And it takes a little bit of research to see that the last time SSBCI really kind of rolled around was during the Jobs Act. And some of that money was supposed to go to, and this is a newer term, SETI individuals, but it didn't. And lots of organizations that you all know of that fund companies from a state level, and some of them not even from a state level, got their start there. So the largest funds in my state of Ohio got started with federal dollars. They got a match and they got started. So those early 10, 20, $50 million funds got started with our tax dollars. And so this time around, I'm making certain that I'm loud enough. And I know, Rodney, you were making certain that you are loud enough to say, hey, Treasury Department, hey, my state, hey, my senator. I had dinner with Congresswoman Joyce Beatty not too long ago. And I think she understands more today than she did during the Jobs Act on how these things needed to be written for us to actually make a change. Because as to your point, private capital has always been around. But this public capital is super important because private is not fixing this problem for us, right?
Exactly.
We wouldn't have civil rights without the government doing it and everybody marching toward that. Private wasn't doing the work, and private is not going to fix at all people of color getting capital properly.
That's excellent introduction to what's out there, but also what some of the challenges are. I want to speak to that specifically for a minute. So, going back to the first instance of SSBCI was during the Obama administration. I had an opportunity to testify in actually some hearings because it was the U.S. Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship, was chaired by the time by former Congresswoman, Mary Landrieu at the time. And so the whole concept, I was, testifying, trying to get venture into the conversation. And it was like, oh no, that's over there. What they did was they said, well, the Startup America Partnership has got that piece, right? We've got that kind of covered. And so instance one of SSBCI did result in, like, if you look at TechCo out of Maryland, their venture, there was something in, I want to say Hawaii, and there was a third third state that participated, and that was it. This time around, they're actually saying that State Small Business Credit Initiative, they really, really want them to focus a lot on venture. But this is part of the challenge, even when it comes to working federally at state level and public-private partnerships, is, how like we talk about in coding, you got to know the language and you got to understand the syntax and you got to understand the context. Well, even in policy and law, you got to understand the words and the context because it evolves. So when SSBCI first came out the second time in the Biden administration, everyone was using the words racial equity. But by the time it actually came out, it had been moved from racial equity with a focus on Black and Latinx small businesses to an evolved term of socially economically disadvantaged individuals. And so what it did was it increased who qualified for SETI. But for instance, a SETI individual could be someone that's living in a community that doesn't have broadband or 5G. But they may not have economic barriers to capital and to other resources. And so what I've learned in this process, we just came off of a contract with Treasury and Commerce with MBDA, helping to shape the technical assistance part of that. And we were lobbying to keep the MBDE definition rather than the SETI, but the career politicians, not the appointees, the career politicians were like, I think it's going to be too hard because we don't know if there's that many Black and brown entrepreneurs. And it was almost like, same thing we deal with. So in the process of forming public-private partnerships, when you go in the rooms, you got to understand the language. And you got to make sure that you're able to advocate and lobby to kind of keep the policy centered, or it's always going to get diluted because it's easier to fulfill diluted promises than non-diluted ones, if that makes sense. Let's pause there. So we've talked about the State Small Business Credit Initiative, which is specific to small business capital. Brent, Shuprotim, talk a little bit about what is being promised in the infrastructure bill, and how are developers thinking about the infrastructure bill, and then maybe juxtapose that to Build Back Better, which is also coming out of Economic Development Agency as well. So we talked about one bucket, startup capital or small business capital. Now let's talk about infrastructure and Build Back Better.
Shuprotim, do you want to start? Because I'm not as close as the infrastructure bill itself. I can speak to a high level, Rodney, and how I've been thinking about it as a developer, just where we sit in the spectrum. Because I feel like, to just break it down simply, I mean, essentially Candice and her organization would be a customer of mine, because we're trying to support organizations like them and the facilities that we have. And from an infrastructure standpoint, if I'm doing a large scale development and I have to pay for the roads and the utilities and the building itself, but I'm going to charge Candice the same rate as I'm charging a Piper Jaffray, that's not going to make any sense. But that's what my cost is. It's just my cost of goods, materials, and time. Mm-hmm. And so the way I've simply framed it is not only how can we leverage the capital that we can tap into as a developer, whether it's tax increment financing, whether it's different grants or subsidies that are localized based upon municipality, or there's even, partnering with university for the Build Back Better program. Those are all things that we can tap into to help support the cost to effectively make it less expensive for Candice to operate, so she can spend more of her funds on supporting the companies and businesses that she's trying to grow and foster and create. I think where I'm trying to lean into more is that, how do I set the stage? And Rodney, you and I have talked about this, where it's not just the capital coming in, it's also me being a little bit more selective on who the tenants are, so they're helping support the ecosystem as a whole. Right. So another way of saying this, and I know this is somewhat done in some locations, is that the tenants that are in buildings, they have to pay a common area maintenance that every person that's leasing a building has to. But how do you do it in a way, if there's certain organizations that are private, how can they help fund not only helping subsidize the cost for those other tenants, but I think even for me personally, even more importantly, how are they helping subsidize the programming or potentially building a venture fund to support those organizations to grow and flourish? So in my mind, it's using essentially real estate again as that conduit to support the tech startups in the biotech industry. But again, also still we have to kind of use the backbone of what's already there, which is the typical public subsidies. But how do we even take it further and try to be selective on the people that are coming into facilities themselves, but having them buy in to that type of investment? Because the reality is, the backbone of the ecosystem is these startups. That's what everybody wants in their ecosystem. That's what everybody strives for. It's figuring out who's going to take that ownership piece, is where I end up getting stuck.
That's incredible. Just to kind of summarize that, when we think about who the limited partners of our funds could be, it could be these massive economic engines in the form of research parks, in the form of innovation districts. We can fund our pre-accelerators, our accelerators, our coding boot camps, our hackathons. Exactly. And so then it helps, it kind of helps you all with your community benefits agreement, which you have a commitment to the community and to the culture. And it also ultimately builds a more equitable environment, because now you've got people who can afford, we talk about addressing affordable housing. Affordable housing is addressing the symptom of unaffordability because of lack of income. If we solve for income, we solve for affordability, right?
Yeah.
And the goal is to get everybody at market rate, because I don't think there's anyone that, if they're able, to literally make market income wouldn't mind paying market rate for their, for their living. Yeah. Shuprotim?
Yeah, I mean, this is all sort of making a lot of sense. I mean, just to kind of set the table, Rodney, you asked a question about sort of some of the federal money flowing in. Yeah. I mean, just to set the stage over here, there's a lot of federal, right? I mean, there's a lot of federal money flowing in. I think between American Rescue Plan and the Investment and Jobs Act, it's, I think close to $4 million. Some of it is going to individuals. A lot of it is going to businesses. The way I tend to sort of wrap my head around all the intricacies over here is try to sort of think about it as, what are the pots of money which go towards infrastructure kind of stuff, which set the framework for businesses to grow and thrive and expand, and what are kind of more programmatic funds that we can actually take and sort of shape. So a quick example on the infrastructure side of the table, broadband, right? So there is going to be pretty significant, each state is going to get up to $5 million, I believe, to do broadband plan, right? And there is not a single state, there is not a single city in this country which doesn't have disparities in broadband sort of access, right? Affordable, fast broadband access. So thinking about that as infrastructure money over here, and we've done this work in New York City, I'm doing this work in Rhode Island now, sort of how do we bring sort of affordable broadband access to, let's say, parts of New York City, like public housing residents, right? Who don't have access to broadband at those rates. Same in sort of, this is the same situation which I find ourselves in Rhode Island, lots of geographical disparities. How do we bring broadband? Because to me, sort of thinking about the tech ecosystem, this is one of the fundamental pieces of the tech ecosystem is like, cheap, available connection to technology and sort of all the other sort of, ecosystem elements, Candice, that you were talking about in a virtual world we live. So that's kind of one piece of the puzzle over here from an infrastructure perspective. And then from a programmatic perspective, it's really interesting sort of, and Candice, I'm really curious sort of because this is your world, you deal on a daily basis. When I talk to sort of startups and founders, they kind of tell me like they sometimes they often have money to start, like friends and family, maybe some angel investors. They have something to sort of, they have an idea, they get some money together, bootstrap it. And then if they go beyond a stage, sort of they can get some sort of angel investment, some sort of Series A, Series B, Series C, whatever it is. It's the middle where, we are between sort of a year to 3 years where there isn't, to your point, sort of private capital, unless you know someone or you're successful before or you have a network, right? And which, let's all sort of agree, for a lot of Black, Latinx women entrepreneurs in the tech ecosystem are just not there, right? So how do you get that sort of middle gap funding? And I think sort of thinking about public sort of funds, federal, state public funds, programmatic funds could be really important. The thing that I'm sort of working in Rhode Island right now is helping the state essentially apply for, up to $100 million of Build Back Better grants. And there it's really interesting, sort of the partnership is between the University of Rhode Island, which is Rhode Island's public university, and the state's Department of Commerce. But underneath those, you have a whole array of private companies. And what we've been pushing really, really hard is a lot of local community-based organizations who can filter out their specific needs and their ideas in terms of programming. So that's informing the sort of the full arc of the programmatic ask that Rhode Island is making to the EDA for BBBRC funds.
Thank you for that. And when you say there's so many buckets of money, I know Jen just dropped a link in the chat as well. I'll mention a few other ones that are really contextual to like ecosystem building. I want you all to search in your kind of your research time. We used to say spare time. Nobody has spare time anymore, just like we don't have spare change. But in the time that you've allocated to research, take a look at the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act. And as a part of that act, check out the Endless Frontier Act. So what's interesting about this particular bill, it was co-sponsored by Schumer and Ro Khanna. So, you're talking like OG Democrat and then sort of, Bernie bro Democrat. Very, very progressive politics with Ro Khanna, who's the congressman from Silicon Valley. They linked up with Mark Warner. They were able to get Republican support to get this bill, I think, initially through the Senate, which was unheard of. And the way they sold it was, and it was interesting the way they compromised to sell it. And I just want to give you the context of how laws get passed. They didn't sell it under the context of like, a lack of innovation and a lack of jobs, and poverty as a national security issue. They basically said, we have to do this because China is becoming more innovative or more innovative than the United States. And so they sold it to Republicans under the auspices of national security, but not national security in terms of what's happening, kind of homegrown poverty that we think is being, accelerated, people feeling left out, and you're focusing on one demographic. What does that mean for me? And most people's pain and anger comes out of their lack or their perceived lack of access, contextual to where they are. And so, but anyway, they use that kind of psychological head trip to get bipartisan support. And so it's to establish 18 new regional tech hubs in the United States outside of the coast. So this money will not go to California. It won't go to, kind of mainline New York, upstate New York still, and it won't go to Massachusetts. They specifically, or Seattle, Washington. We were able to work on some of the legislation on the bill, and we weren't able, here again, to get racial equity. Look, 2020, first of all, we couldn't even really say racial equity, all the time until 2020. And then we started saying it, and people were like, hashtagging Black Lives Matter. I get it, but they weren't doing anything. And so by the time we tried to get this into the legislation, it got watered down to a geographical designation rather than designations or regions that had density of Black, Latinx, and indigenous folks, okay? So then we came back around and said, well, if at least one of the geographies for these tech hubs, regional tech hubs, could be where there's a designation of minority serving institutions and HBCUs. So we were able to ensure that a majority Black and brown city will get access to these dollars because of the ones that have a density of minority serving institutions. So here again, you got to be, witty in how you lobby, advocate, and navigate and negotiate to be able to get resources back to your respective communities. But definitely take a look at that. And then one more I'll mention, and then I want to move towards the final question before we go to Q&A, is Congressman Hank Johnson also put forth a cybersecurity bill that has passed the House and the Senate. And this one is specifically to bring grant funding to HBCUs, specifically for cybersecurity, entrepreneurship, and education. So be on the watch for that. It passed the House, passed the Senate, but now it's got to go into caucus. And caucus is where things can get really, really interesting. Because when people see a bill getting momentum that eventually will get to a president's desk for consideration, they try to withhold their vote unless they could attach something to it, okay? And so a lot of this is happening real time with trillions of dollars that are coming into the economy. Now, let's, in our final few minutes, before we go into the Q&A, would each of you talk about how you believe, racial equity, gender equity, LGBTQI equity, differently able equity, really intersectional equity can be included in these private-public partnerships.
So,
Candice, we'll
Rodney,
start with you. Yep.
yeah, I think I mean, you raised an amazing point. I obviously, I talk about Ohio a lot because I spent a lot of time, I live there, and I've navigated my way through government quite a bit. And like, so this isn't about feeling good. This isn't about social justice. You can get anything passed in a bipartisan manner if you just remove all the feelings and just talk about the economics of things. So we have a gap and we have some people we are not serving. And if not everyone is participating in an economy, the economy can't grow and thrive. If we have huge swaths of people, women, people of color, veterans, disabled, we just talk about the gaps that we need to fill. And I said, absolutely, Lieutenant Governor Husted, I feel you. And that is the best advice I've been given. I think that we work to get legislation cleared for all, but we start having capacity building conversations amongst each other, right? That's what you and I do, Rodney. You'll call me, you'll copy me on an email, and I'll know what the game is this week. How do I play this game? How do we all play this game together? Because my majority peers have been playing this game with the government for a long time. We just need to make certain we stay on top of it. So I think that that's how we work through things. We make certain things get passed for all so that all Americans move the needle. Yeah. We make certain that our legislators know that it is important that we are included. And then we have these capacity building conversations amongst each other so that we all know how to fill out the applications, that we know the language that we need to have. Like we just over the last 6 months have gotten a $5 million investment from our state. We have to have that matched. It goes into our fund. We got another $1 million to build our headquarters from the state of Ohio. We got $11 million from a university that matched part of that money to build our headquarters in the state of Ohio. Why do those things happen? Because we're talking about building the economy for more people so that more jobs are created, more revenue is there, more investments are attracted. And so it's just making certain, like you said, learning the language and then sharing the knowledge.
Definitely.
Ronnie, one thing that came to mind is an open source model, or instead a different way. I mean, you talk about partnerships. Partnerships have to happen every step of the way. One thing that I think is unique across the country right now is even some stuff that we've been exploring is a lot of universities have started to shift to more development-led structures because they're trying to de-risk their land and their capital and have the developers take all that risk. And so we really sit at this unique epicenter where we can actually drive those partnerships, but I only know my world. And that's why I value being on this panel today, hearing from Candice and Shuprotim and having a connection with you, because the partnerships that we're able to create and the conversations that I can have only help me build the case, because simply, yes, I am just working on the four walls, but I get to lean in because I get to decide how the investment and the framework is set up. And so the more the context that I have, and said another way, again, that more open source model so other developers can follow the framework, it's going to make it easier for other people to create that stage or create the ecosystems the appropriate way. And I think you know that I'm bought in. It's just how do you make it easier for others to do the same thing? I feel like that's the way that a lot of developers think. They always take it's capital. It takes the easiest path. And how do we challenge it? And I can only do that through partnerships and having conversations like this. It's the only way, because I'm bought in, like I said, but I'm only one person. So hopefully there's another opportunity to continue this conversation. I know there's going to be a lot of opportunities to explore this, especially with how much funding is actually coming in. and how much focus there is right now on creating this type of equity. So I'm definitely all ears and willing to continue to learn more. Thank you for the opportunity.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Shuprotim, you wanna comment before we jump to Q&A?
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, I feel like all three of you are sort of in the trenches on this, and I feel like much less qualified to actually speak on this. But I'm just thinking about sort of some of the inside baseball stuff, Rodney, that you talked about in terms of how sort of the sausage making of legislation happens and how you got to sort of convince people and wean them off certain things. The one, like in a previous life, I used to work for the New York City government, and one of the things that sort of I took from that time was, there's legislation, which is whatever is there, and that sets a framework. But there's also regulation, right? Like, how do you take a piece of law and implement it on the ground? And so I think there's a real opportunity, even if maybe we couldn't get everything in the legislation, there's a real opportunity to start thinking about the regs and talking to the actual bureaucrats, whether at the state level or the local level, saying, how are you going to implement this piece of law on the ground, right? And I think there's a real way for us to think about that piece over here, because I think there is some real value, even if the legislation didn't get us as far as we could have wanted to. How do you implement the law? Who are the people who are going to evaluate your applications for funding? What are some of the characteristics and attributes and metrics they can set under that framework? I think those are places, which there can be still sort of ample scope for intervention.
No, I agree. Good deal. We're going to jump into some Q&A at this time. If anyone attending has a question, you can raise your hand and I will acknowledge it, and you can come on screen and ask your question.
I just want to point to Chuck Summers asked an earlier question as you were talking about the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act, and wanted to know if you think it will pass this year.
I'm looking at Chuck's questions now. It's really hard to say, because I think there was a lot of momentum for it. Early on. I think early on, a lot of people. I know I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and we were talking to different congressional leaders who wanted input, and we ended up spending some time with the kind of the Science and Technology Committee. Everyone was incredibly interested in it. But I mean, look at the state of the world, today. And I think we've got to. There's priorities now. So you think about what's happening in Washington and what's happening in Europe. What's going on in Ukraine right now. All of those things become top of mind, and then folks once again start to divert attention. And so I think the strategies, we can show the contextualization of how they connect, right? Why is it important for America to be competitive as innovators, right? How do we continue to build within as we continue, to play our role abroad? But it's really, really hard to say. What's interesting is, I think the first version, Chuck, was incredibly idealistic, but by the time they, cut a few billions off, it became more realistic. And, I'll be honest with you, the billions of dollars that are going into these different initiatives right now, pre-COVID, everyone would have told you that it was impossible. But, post 2 multi-trillion-dollar recovery plans, all of a sudden folks are like, okay, that number doesn't seem as large. When we used to talk to cities and regions and developers that if you truly want to build a Black tech ecosystem, it's going to cost you $75 million, $100 million for 10 years. Most folks is laughed us out of the room. And now that we can show the unit economics of what it actually costs to run, a conference, what it takes to run hackathons, boot camps, pre-accelerators, accelerators, incubators, seed funds, follow-on funds. When you start adding it up, you know, you can't do it for $100,000 a year. You can't even do that for $1 million a year. And so I think people now have a better idea of what it actually costs. And I think that the federal sector and the public sector can learn from the private sector, but especially learn from the venture sector. The amount of money we invest and the risks we take to get the outcomes we do is a true lesson in risk taking and a true lesson in innovation. But what no one talks about is all of the millions of jobs that are created in the meantime, even if they're jobs for 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years. And that's why startups are producing 60% of net new jobs, is because all of that venture capital and hopefully customers are helping to produce those companies. And most folks are not working at companies for more than 3 years anyway now. So if your company, you know, doesn't make it, and then you go to the next startup or the next startup, and then you eventually, you know, end up in, you know, a stable role, that's where work is headed anyway. So we might as well invest more money in this sector if we want to truly be the most innovative, you know, nation on earth. Aaron, I see your hand, and then Alfred, to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, so Brent talked about an open source resource, and so I'm just going to speak this into existence. I'll probably be running Alaska's SSBCI fund. I'll probably be given $10 million, and based on performance can expand that. But I also ran the SSBCI fund before, and it was super difficult to focus on, I started a BIPOC fund and was just slammed with multiple threats of lawsuits at the state and the municipality level. So I feel like there's a federal push to focus on MBDAs and SETI individuals and such, but at the local and the state level, there's tons of pushback, and it gets really complicated navigating the multi-levels of governance. So are there resources for how to navigate this? I mean, I think what we were held up against was, I think it was Oregon. They started a Black fund or a fund for Black entrepreneurs with PPP money or something like that. And so they just got sued like crazy, and they had to give it all back. And so that's sort of what I really, really struggled with in trying to do this kind of work when I held the purse strings.
Right. They that win are wise. And I think it's a part of what Candice was saying. You know, the federal government, you know, look, I was lobbying to keep the ethnic definitions for Minority Business Development Agency, which, by the way, was an agency and now has been codified as an administration. Their budget is going from like 25 million to 250 million. So that's major. But you look at SETI, socially economically disadvantaged individuals, you know, in Alaska, you know, Vermont, Oregon, you're gonna have to play the language game. And ultimately, you're gonna have to from my perspective, you're gonna have to let the founders be your allies and your activists. Because if the founders are getting capital, then the founders are gonna say, without this, we wouldn't get capital. And so I think you're gonna have to be, you know, witty in that perspective. You know, I don't know if there are any other folks that want to comment on actual resources, you know, to how to counter, you know, legal attacks, you know, or what have you.
Yeah, I would say, Rodney, like, and Aaron, maybe point to our fund in Ohio. So we're an Ohio supported fund. We have state dollars in the fund. Our application was approved with a BIPOC focus. Very likely, and, you know, fingers crossed, just like you, we'll see some SSBCI dollars flowing back through to us because we've already been approved at the state level to focus on this particular demographic of people. Republican governor, like we are very red state. and it was approved. We are on the state website. And so if you need any additional information, I can drop my my email address to you, and I'm happy to talk about it.
I can speak to this for a second. I was going to echo your comments, Rodney, because I actually ran into this with a fund that was going to be created through a development that I was working on. And the city staff ran into some issues, and they had some concerns about the legality of actually having those funds be directed for developers of color only. And so the thought that we're coming up right now with the city is kind of what you're recommending is a little bit more semantics. How can you frame it in a way where you know that that specific group is likely going to get the funds? And I'm not sure how you put thresholds in place to make sure that that group gets the funds, but that's the strategy that we're deploying right now, knowing the concerns that the city has about potential lawsuits.
Yeah.
If I just might add, if I just might quickly add, I think sort of all of us are saying this in different ways, but you know, one way of thinking about this is thinking about outcomes, right? I mean, and I'm not going to take away, you know, the symbolism of a fund called a Black fund or a BIPOC entrepreneurs fund or whatever. That itself, you know, has enormous symbolism. But if that really runs into kind of, you know, the teeth of opposition, legal opposition or whatever it is there a different way to get to the same outcomes? And this is what I hear Brent, you talking about.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yes.
I mean, like at the end of the day, it's not ideal, but sort of I don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of good. I'll call it something else. But again, within the realm of the law and the regulation, is there an opportunity for me to change the criteria, change the focus, what have you, so I can potentially get maybe not 100% of the same outcomes that I hoped for, but maybe like 75, 80, 90%.
I'm gonna 30 seconds on this. You know, I had some fun with some conversations I was having with some limited partners and that we were pitching. And I basically was like, look at all the data. The data shows, you know, when, you know, women on decision-making teams. And I know when I context, we say women, that's normally not inclusive of Black and brown women. It's really meaning white women. And so, but, you know, women on decision-making teams, 15% greater economic output. You add Black, Latinx, Indigenous to that, 35. So let's do simple math. That says like 45%. So I actually told a GP that he was breaking his fiduciary to his limited partners, but not investing in Black women. Because if your goal is to provide the greatest opportunity for return, and I can show you data that's respected by McKinsey and Company, Case Foundation, et cetera, that if you are to maintain your fiduciary to your investors, then you have to make sure, you know, so, you know, and sometimes I have conversations that some people may not be willing to double click in on or go all the way. And so balance is sort of the key in terms of what I was going for disruptive transformation in that conversation, because I think limited partnership in America is contextually broken, because if we fix the LP situation around equity, it should fix the GP situation, and it should fix the founder situation to some degree. That's a whole nother conversation that we can definitely have. But I think balance is the key in all things. Read your room in your state, right? What Candice was able to get done in Ohio, I can't get done in Georgia, but I can get it done in Atlanta. And what I can get done in Atlanta, I might be able to get done in North Carolina or maybe, you know, another state. So read the room in your state and govern yourselves accordingly. We're a little bit over, but I'm gonna go ahead and get Alfred's question in real quick.
Can I just interject really quick, Rodney, and just say, you know, since we are over time, thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists. You are all welcome to stay. Most of our panelists did offer to stay a few additional minutes because we had a group of students who they would engage with, but you know, we do want to get to Alfred's question. So I just wanted to say that before we get to Alfred.
Absolutely. And we're officially in the student chat now, y'all. So Alfred, and then other students, please get your conversation, no points ready.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep, go for it.
All right. First, I also want to say I'm really impressed by everybody on the call. I've never met any of you guys before, and I've been on several calls like this. Just as somebody who's been obsessed with this topic since before it became a trending topic. You know, I've always wanted to make a difference and increase with generational wealth for our communities and just bridge that racial wealth gap. One thing for me, just seeing all you guys and just seeing so many people who are tackling this problem, and the data shows, as Rodney was just saying, that more money than ever is pouring into these things. One thing I just have to ask you guys is, how do we increase the accessibility for people like me, who I'm just a recent college graduate, 1 year out of college, and I've been doing startups my whole life, and it still has not gotten easy to access capital. I got an internship working at NC Idea, and I was helping people who were Black founders trying to start innovative companies in Black hair care and all these things. And it was still difficult as, excuse the language, but just, you know, put the word there that you want to put there. And it's not getting easier. You know, the funding is increasing, but accessibility wise, you know, how do we interact more with people like you? You know, how do we take these people who are high level doing amazing things? You guys have reached extensively crazy levels in your careers. How do we get you guys to be more accessible to people like me who are just coming out? And we really want to be innovative and create solutions, but it's just not, we're not accessing you guys, because the Black VCs, the 100 angel funds, all these things, the wait lists are long. You know what I mean? It's only like 10 of us that get in, it's thousands of us that apply. And yeah, you know, I really want to change that, because there's more than enough people out there in the Black community and outside of the Black community who want to support us. It's no reason why there shouldn't be capital available and jobs available for people who really want to make a difference.
Man, you're right. Those folks over at 100 Black Angels, they're terrible, man.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
That's us. I'm just joking on ourselves. I mean, I'll respond. I'll let everybody else who can, you know, look, man, I'll be 50 this year, and it still hadn't gotten easier. Like I've raised a total of, 20 million in VC. My wife and I just, put our own money together, bought the company that we started 22 years ago back. You think it'd be easier? You think after all the racial equity commitments in 2020, I should have $1 billion fund. Lightship should be $1 billion fund. It's never gonna get easy, and that's just the reality of it. But you gotta create a resolve in you to not quit, and to also not let the ecosystem define your worth and even your wealth based upon what you can get out of it. Now, to the second part, how do you get access to like some of the folks on the room? I'll tell you something that a mentor of mine, Dr. John Maxwell, told me this 20 years ago, is you got to add value to people to get access to people. Because we rarely have the time to do the one-on-one mentorship that we used to be able to do, just because of the demands on our time. We have families, we have children, we lived through COVID just like you did. You know what I mean? It's like we are human beings as well. But if you can find a unique way to add value to any of the people on this panel, they'll figure out a way to give you an opportunity. And so John Maxwell said, extend a heart before you extend a hand. Most people come and extend their hand first, and they don't extend their heart. And I think philosophically, if you can figure out that nuance, the fact that I hear you, like, you make me want to figure out how to do something with you. I don't know if I can or not, but I definitely want to talk to you.
Yeah, I'll add that ideas don't get funded, companies do. So as soon as somebody comes up with an idea, is not the time that you should go ask for money. You should try to build something first. I love revenue positive companies. And so go try to sell it. Go try to sell that thing and then come and visit. Our website is wide open, lightship.foundation. There's an application, anyone could apply. We have lots of programs, online pitch competition. We've got our boot camp. We have our accelerator. Where we make investments. And there are conferences around the country that we are all speaking at all the time. So Black Tech Week. Some of us have gone to Afrotech, South by Southwest, CES, Black Women Talk Tech, Black Men Talk Tech. I'm going to drop a link. I'm at South by Southwest in a couple of weeks. So that's all the places that I'm speaking there. And I know Rodney, for him, this is true also. We work ourselves really hard for our community. And so we work until we almost pass out. And so I bet you we would look 20 years younger than we are right now. So no, we are all very available, but it's not going to be easy. This is just not going to be easy work. I think you should work on your company from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., the time that you are probably wasting time on the internet, and build a company. And not everybody's going to get funded. The people who make it through are the people who should have made it through in the first place. So it's hard because you just have to get past the place of not complaining about it and just focus on building the business. Because sometimes help isn't going to come. And that's just the unfortunate fact.
If you get to South by Southwest, I'll sponsor your badge. I'll give you a badge.
There you go.
All right. March 11th, it starts March 11th. You can go from March 11th through the 20th. Most of us are there from the 11th through the 14th. I'll give you a badge.
And believe me, there are folks that are willing to like share an Airbnb or their hotel room. Lots of people get doubles. Like I've gone to South by and not had a place in my 30s, and I made it. So you just got to work your way and maneuver your way through these different rooms. And I think we've all done it. We've all done it. I started my first tech company in 14 and here I am. So you can do it if you put your mind to it.
Good deal. Any more questions at this point, students? Let's see some of the students. I don't see a lot of you there. Let's see. Okay.
Rodney, I put a question in the chat and it sort of piggybacked off of Alfred's question.
Okay.
You know, for the panelists, how would you recommend for those that are within the ecosystem? And I think Aspen said earlier, some of us are founders, some of us are ecosystem builders, some of us are in the funding space. But what's the best way to be a part of the decision-making process for these equitable and accessible funds? Or, you know, maybe it's just funds and they're not equitable and they're not accessible. How do we get involved so that we are part of the decision-making process and not just being on the receiving end of it?
It's a great question. I'll answer it and I'll open it up. So I think first let's compartmentalize and talk about the type of funding it is, right? And then talk about the complexity of that funding type. So when you think about the startup ecosystem, the first type of capital is normally coming out of a pre-accelerator or accelerator, right? At the end, you might get a $50,000 check, $25,000 check. Lightship is, changing the game with $500,000 checks. Those programs are looking for people to work on those teams. And those are usually smaller teams that you can get access to, right? This is like pre-VC. And then by the time you get to like VC, now, even before that, there's some pitch competitions like 43 North, Atlanta Startup Battle, just, Rise of the Rest, where, you could go and serve as a volunteer and literally work and meet all the investors and meet all of the stakeholders, right? So it's ways of, I talk about this in Kingonomics, like the currency of service and how to serve your way into networks. And then once you serve your way into a network, you show your competency inside of that network. And I'll pause there. Perhaps, Candice or Brent could talk about at the venture level or the development level, how do people get on decision-making teams at venture funds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, at a fund, it's a little bit more difficult just because it does take some level of skill and learning. So, but I do truly believe, like you said, it's a lot of being in the rooms, but being in those rooms and maybe not contributing right away and listening. I think I have had a lot of folks around me personally in the ecosystem that immediately want to try to go fix everything and haven't listened and identified the problem before they try to fix it. So just spending some time and not losing sight of your goals, but also just making certain that you don't give up. This is a game of not giving up. I think that that's absolutely a fact. But to get into a fund, I think that's a larger conversation. Funding and funds are just completely different.
Yeah, maybe this is responding as maybe a pitch to be a developer, but that is the benefit for being in the seat that I'm in, as well as being with an organization that supports me and having this be important with how I'm doing work. And so if it is a priority for you to have that type of control, I'm able to do that through the built environment. I'm building the business plan and case that I'm getting investors on board on. and I get to control who invests, and I get to have a say on who eventually will own it. So I sit again in a little bit of a unique position, but all again, more of a reason to become a developer. I mean, it does come with a lot of risk. And like I said, you have to have the right partnerships like the people that are on this call. But you also do have you need to have an organization that believes and really supports in what you want to do.
Excellent.
If I could just quickly add, I mean, I see myself, even though I do a lot of work in tech, primarily as a consumer of tech, right? And I go back to the point that Candice, you were making to, I guess, Alfred's question about who asked about accessibility, like build a company, build a product. And when I sort of read a lot about tech and all that stuff, it seems to me a lot of the stuff that's being talked about is like, how do I get something which would take like ordinarily 2 days of time to your doorstep in like 15 minutes? You know, whether it's a widget or it's, you know, it's a movie or it's, you know, it's a, you know, it's dinner or whatever it is. So I often question myself, like, you know, and I'm sure you see this as someone who's sort of funding ventures, is like, what do we think of actually coming up with a service or a product that's not sort of disrupting stuff like getting to my place in 15 minutes as opposed to 2 days, but something else. And I don't know what that something else is, but I'm curious as to sort of, you know, from your point of view, sort of what you see when people come to you and sort of make pitches and have sort of services to sort of offer.
Definitely. And we've been talking, just to wrap this up, we've been talking about federal funding.
Well, that was also part of it, is, you know,
Yeah.
not just the venture side, but, you know,
Yeah.
you're talking about there's millions and, you know, more
Millions.
money than ever flowing in from the public side. Short of hiring a lobbyist, I mean, you know, how do we get into those conversations?
Yeah. Well, you know what? The Jobs Act that Candice alluded to, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, which, you know, while it became known as the Equity Crowdfunding Act, bipartisan support, got signed, you know, April 5th, 2012 by Obama. We saw a lot of people use equity crowdfunding last year. It was advocacy driven. No lobbyists were involved. And basically I was a part of kind of like that core team back in the day. We literally were calling congressional leaders, and basically, thanks so much, Brent. We were, you know, calling on congressional leaders and doing unofficial lobbying. And literally, like, you can pick up the phone now and you could call a federal agency, you could call a congressional leader, you call your senator, and you could basically say, hey, I hear there's something about state small business credit initiative, there's this bill, there's that bill. I want to make sure that it's going to be inclusive. What can I do? The other thing is you can get involved in policy formation before it becomes policy, right? You can work at Brookings. You can volunteer at Brookings. You know, you in your state, get to know every state, as many state legislators as you can, and basically say, I want to be involved with this. I want to be involved in this. And so and then run for office. You know, these are unprecedented times, but those are all of the different options that I can think of. It's too late after someone is elected, and it's too late after the bill is law, right? And once it's ruled on, we got to get more involved in the formation of policies that are for us, by us, and for all. All right. Okay, Aspen.
That might be all.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, all the attendees for coming to join the session tonight, and thank you to the speakers for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your insights, and also your time, which we know all of those components are valuable. This was a really great discussion, and you know, we're happy as the Entrepreneurship Center to, you know, facilitate this interaction. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Candice.
You're welcome. Good night.
Okay.
Bye.